Hello and welcome to the final Friday of NCSL's State Policy 101 series. You made it. Today's session is all about bringing people with disabilities into the workforce. But before we jump into content, let's get started with a quick pop quiz. Please click on the first poll question on your screen. While you're answering, I'm going to cover a couple of things. As I mentioned, today's session is about bringing people with disabilities into the workforce. So today we're going to begin by quickly running through some disability history to give us a clear understanding of how we got to where we are today, followed by a conversation with Tennessee State Senator Becky Massey, who will bring some of the policy pages to life that I'm going to cover here shortly. And then we'll conclude with some NCSL resources and some of our partner resources, as well as ways that NCSL can help you in your legislative work. Now let's turn back to that poll question. Our question was, how many Americans have a disability? The answer is 26%, or 1 in 4. Now, this might be more than you expected. This might be less than you expected. I wanted to start off with this metric because I think it really helps put into perspective just how many people we are talking about when we say people with disabilities. We're talking about 26% of the population, millions of Americans, 1 in 4 people. These folks are neighbors, these are colleagues, and these are, most importantly, people in your state. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Josh Cunningham, who's going to run through some of the policies that have shaped life for these millions of Americans.
Great, thanks for kicking us off there, Sage. I'm gonna, as Sage mentioned, I'm gonna go through kind of a brief history of policies that have really pushed the conversation of disability employment forward, and get to where we are today. And disability is truly a natural part of the human experience. From ancient times to today, people with disabilities have lived amongst the population. They share the same hopes and dreams as everybody else. But for much of that history, and for even a good part of American history, society has treated people with disabilities in a pretty negative way, as outcasts or defective, as incapable and not worthy of being included in society. Now, luckily, that perception has changed over probably really the last 50 years, and the policies relating to disability issues have followed that evolution as well. One of the first federal policies that really addressed disability issues and sought to support people with disabilities was the Civil War pension programs that were established during the Civil War. The federal law awarded pensions to Union soldiers who had been injured, severely injured, to the point where it was assumed that they wouldn't be able to work anymore. So the government said that we will support those soldiers and their families financially due to the fact that they would no longer be able to work. And a lot of the Confederate states actually had similar programs for the Confederate soldiers as well. Well, those were great help. They were all, again, based on this assumption that people with disabilities really weren't capable of participating in the labor force. And that's kind of a sentiment that was that lasted probably another 100 years after that, with the exception of one law that was enacted by Congress in 1920 called the Industrial Rehabilitation Act. And this established what we know today as the vocational rehabilitation programs, which are a federal run program, federally managed or federally regulated, but administered at the state level. And VR is a critical service to many people with disabilities, as it helps develop employable skills and helps connect people with disabilities to work and career opportunities. Now, some of the other key enactments at the federal level that we've seen over the years that followed that 1920 law, again, sought to help financially people with disabilities. So things like the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, which was the first federal disability benefit program. It was enacted in 1956 initially, and that provided financial benefits, cash benefits, to people who had been in the workforce, but who had been injured or developed a disability somewhere along the line that has removed them from the workforce. And so those people, assuming that they now are unable to work anymore, can be eligible for this federal benefit. Similarly, in 1972, the second federal disability benefit program was established, the Supplemental Security Income Program, or SSI. And that covered a lot of people with disabilities who maybe weren't covered under the SSDI, while people who were born with a disability or who developed one in their youth. And so those with severe disabilities who it is assumed that they will never be able to work. And so they have access to a separate federal disability benefit. Now, again, those benefits are critical to many, many people with disabilities in this country, but they also don't necessarily address the people with disabilities who can and want to work. And up until that point in 1972, there was people with disabilities who wanted to work faced a number of barriers, most of which perhaps was the fact that discrimination based on disability was not something that was prohibited in any way in federal law. In 1973, Congress took the first crack at eliminating discrimination in the workplace based on disability with the passage of the Rehabilitation Act. And that prohibited discrimination, employment discrimination for federal agencies, federal contractors, and any other entity that received federal funding. And it was really the first time that the federal government had proclaimed that discrimination based on disability is a thing, that it exists and that it needs to be eliminated. And 17 years following that, in 1990, Congress passed, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as you'll see on this next slide, the ADA covers a lot of ground. It was a landmark piece of legislation and one of the rare bills that is truly a household name and that has impacted every American in some way. And in fact, I'd encourage you guys in your chat, those who are listening, to maybe say like a word or two about what you think of when you think of the ADA and the impact that it's had on this country or on your life. I know for me, the ADA represents acceptance. It is accepting the fact that every person is born different and that we all experience life a little bit differently, and maybe we have medical issues that affect us in different ways, or we find ourselves in accidents that impact us in different ways. But we accept the fact that that happens, and we accept the fact that people are different, and we accept the fact that that's okay. And that doesn't preclude anybody from being able to experience life the same way as anyone else. The ADA was really a proclamation that every American, regardless of disability status, has a right to participate in everyday major life activities like working, like shopping, like engaging with their government, communicating and using technology, or commuting. That these are key activities that are essential to American society. And disability should not preclude anybody from engaging in those things. The other thing the ADA really did was it shifted the burden from the person with the disability trying to find a way to access these things to society as a whole. Society as a whole now must adapt itself to make itself accessible to all Americans. The Title I of the ADA addressed employment. And again, employment, very key to participation in American society. You need a source of income. And the ADA did two really important things related to unemployment. It eliminated and prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability in all places of work, all employment, whether public or private. But it took it a step further. Not only did it say you can't discriminate in your hiring, in your promotions, in your firings, but you also have to make your jobs accessible to everyone. And so employers must provide reasonable accommodations in the workplace for workers who need it so that they have access to that employment opportunity. And it's interesting because that kind of sounds like it's a big burden on employers, but in fact, the vast majority of workplace accommodations are either free or cost roughly under $500. So the research has shown that it really isn't actually that big of a burden in most cases. But while the ADA did create a great foundation for full inclusion in the workforce for people with disabilities, we aren't quite there yet. And states are in a great position to really build on that foundation and help close some of the existing gaps that we still see in the labor force. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sage, and she's going to go over some of those more current figures to really illustrate where those gaps are and some options that are available to US states to help narrow those gaps.
Thank you, Josh. I want to begin kind of before I get into the employment situation. I want to begin by talking about why we are talking about employment for people with disabilities. As Josh just mentioned, the ADA covers pretty much every aspect of life. So why are we so focused specifically on employment? Well, for two reasons, really. The first is we will see is that there is a large share of people with disabilities who wish to work and who are not working. And so there really lies this large untapped pool of skilled labor and people that are just kind of waiting to be put in. And this is actually a population that's expected to double in the next 20 years. So this large untapped pool of labor is only going to continue to grow. The second reason is perhaps even more important, which is that with a job comes a paycheck, and with that paycheck comes economic independence and self-sufficiency. And these, again, are really the principles that underlie pieces of legislation like the ADA, as well as other landmark pieces of legislation that Josh outlined. So without further ado, let's jump into the employment situation as it stands right now for people with disabilities. You see on your screen a chart mapping the unemployment rate. And even though, as you can see, there has been some progress in terms of lowering that overall unemployment rate, there's still a pretty significant gap, right, that we see over this 10-year span. We see in red the unemployment rate for people with disabilities, in blue the unemployment rate for people without disabilities. So despite it, again, trending down, we're seeing this persistent gap. And indeed, if you were to extend these figures to today, you would see the same thing. So in January of this year, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities was almost twice that of people without disabilities. And this is something that holds when we look at other key employment indicators, such as the employment to population ratio. This measures the number of people in a given population that are working relative to that total number of people. So you see here that that's 70.5% for people without disabilities, and that drops to 28.7% for people with disabilities. I also want to note this kind of cliff effect that we see, and that does correspond with the first coronavirus-related shutdowns. And in fact, people with disabilities were more impacted by those shutdowns. About 1 in 5 people with disabilities lost work, whereas 1 in 7 people without disabilities lost work. So moving on, we also see this trend in our labor force participation rate, another key employment indicator. For people without disabilities, that has been about 70.5%. And for people with disabilities, that figure drops to almost about a third. And strikingly, this has about stayed the same. If you see that black line since mid-2017. So we see that on average, people with disabilities, only about a third of them are actively participating in the labor force. So all of that, despite the fact that we know the majority, the overwhelming majority, 2/3 of people with disabilities wish to work. So what's going on here? Well, there are certain barriers that exist to the labor market for people with disabilities. And these include just a couple of things that I've listed on this slide. These include things such as attitudinal or social barriers. That's stigma, assuming that a person with a disability can't work as effectively as somebody without a disability. These include physical barriers, inaccessible workplaces, communication barriers, lack of access to potentially assistive technology that would help better facilitate communication between colleagues. And this also includes policy, education, and transportation barriers. So again, this disconnect between the number of people with disabilities that wish to work and the number of people with disabilities who are working really caused some alarm. And so in 2016, the Council of State Governments, in conjunction with the National Conference of State Legislatures, convened a bipartisan task force of lawmakers to address and identify and address some of the barriers that I just mentioned that exists for people with disabilities. And what they created was a seminal report called the Work Matters Report. And this really underpins all of our work in the disability employment policy space. This is a comprehensive framework of 13 distinct policy options distilled into these 5 policy buckets or categories that you see on your screen here. This is, again, kind of our guiding light when it comes to disability employment policy. And this is also a 90-page report, so I'm not going to be able to cover it in the amount of depth that I wish to here, but there is a link to it in the chat. There's also an updated version. NCSL did an updated 2020 version. We released it in July with even more kind of relevant, timely state examples for you to reference. So moving through these policy buckets, our first is laying the groundwork. And laying the groundwork refers to policies that communicate a state-level commitment to supporting workforce development and employment access and opportunity for people with disabilities. So this includes a concept known as state as a model employer, which is probably the most common policy that we see moving through states today. And it's very similar to what it sounds like. So beyond states being a governing body, they themselves are also large employers. So they have the capacity to serve as a model to the private sector. And this can be accomplished through setting hiring quotas or fast track hiring, creating positions for more people with disabilities in the public sector. Other policies within this area include private sector capacity building, understanding that the state has a role to play or could have a role to play in bolstering the number of private companies that hire people with disabilities by extending things such as tax credits. And then, of course, within this area also lies a focus on disability etiquette, ensuring that there's an awareness around people with disabilities and the work environments that they move into are inclusive and really conducive to their success on the job. Moving into our second policy bucket, preparing for work, this refers to policies which provide education and vocational training opportunities for youth and young adults with disabilities. So people with disabilities are less likely to graduate from high school, they're less likely to enroll and graduate from college, and as we saw, they are less likely to enter the workforce. So preparing for work really seeks to create a pipeline for people with disabilities, for youth with disabilities, as they move through the education system into college and into the workforce. So preparing for work really emphasizes career readiness policies for youth, kind of creating college or existing college preparedness programs and career programs, and helping embed them in existing individualized education programs, and initiating this at the earliest stages of formal education, as early as kindergarten. Research shows us the earlier, the better. Our third policy bucket, getting to and accessing work, refers to policies which ensure that spaces, services, and technologies facilitate equal access to work opportunities. And this is particularly related to transportation technology in the built environment. So people with disabilities often cite inaccessible, unreliable transportation as their most significant barrier to getting to work. So states can help remedy this by increasing reliable, accessible transportation. And this can mean changing existing transportation or leveraging existing emerging technologies, such as autonomous vehicles, wayfinding and navigation, which are designed with universal design principles in mind to be accessible for people with disabilities. States can also decrease the commute altogether by eliminating it, doing something that I've been doing for almost a year now, and I'm sure many of you are too, increasing the use of telework, right? Really mitigating the challenge by, again, eliminating that commute to work altogether. So our fourth policy bucket of 5 is staying at work. So staying at work refers to policies which provide employers with the tools that are necessary to retain and both advance workers when injury, illness, or change in disability status occurs. As Josh mentioned, disability is a natural part of the human experience, and a change in disability status can occur at any point in time. We know that annually 4.6 million workers are injured on the job. And we also know that the likelihood of returning to work for an injured worker decreases significantly the longer that they are out of work. So staying at work really refers to policies which aim to keep these employees attached to their job. So again, it increases pretty significantly, 32% likelihood of returning to work after the first year of being injured. And that 32% likelihood of returning drops to 5% after 2 years. So staying at work really emphasizes, again, keeping employees attached to their job. And this has to do a lot with early intervention, creating comprehensive treatment plans that address the new situation for this employee, and also outline some of the barriers that they may encounter, and also offer strategies for overcoming some of those barriers, so that, again, people, if they do encounter injury or illness on the job, can still remain employed with their current employer. So our final policy bucket, supporting self-employment and entrepreneurship, refers to policies which support access and opportunity for new and existing business owners with disabilities. So people with disabilities are actually more likely to be self-employed than a person without a disability. And states can continue to facilitate this by using things such as state procurement, making sure that people with disabilities are reflected, or disability-owned businesses are reflected in state procurement policies. They can establish a fast-track certification process so that people with disabilities who own businesses can gain access to these certifications. And they can also extend tax and financial incentives to support entrepreneurship. And this could be anything in the form of low interest loans to a person with a disability who's seeking to start a business or become an entrepreneur. So again, this was a lot of information, so I would highly recommend checking out the full report. But I'm curious, as I kind of move through this information, if anything stuck with you. And if you wouldn't mind just dropping that in the chat if you feel comfortable, anything that maybe stuck with you, any policies that maybe you've tried in your state, anything that piqued your interest. And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Josh Cunningham.
Great, thank you, Sage. A lot of really great information, and hopefully that sparks some ideas perhaps for you to look into more in your states. And while you're also adding stuff into the chat, remember that you can also ask questions that we will address at the end as well. So last year represented the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and as part of that, NCSL produced a number of resources and materials kind of acknowledging and celebrating that anniversary. And I believe there's a link in the chat to those resources where you can find those resources on our website. One of those things was we dedicated an episode of NCSL's podcast, Our American States, which I encourage you to subscribe to. And we dedicated one of those episodes to really talking about the ADA and telling its story. And the podcast features a conversation with former Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa. And Senator Harkin was the prime sponsor of the ADA. And in the podcast, he tells kind of the background and why he's interested in this issue, and gives some behind the scenes information on the passage. But we wanted to play a clip for you from that podcast, a short clip that really tells the story of his brother. And to preface this, his brother was became deaf at a young age, and was sent off to a school for the deaf and dumb, as it was called at the time. Again, kind of segregated away, and upon completion of the school, he was given only 3 possible career options. One of those happened to be a baker, which is the one that he chose. And Senator Harkin picks up the story in this clip, talking about his brother as a baker.
So my brother was a baker. He didn't like it, but he was pretty good at it. But he's worked in this small bake shop, Tom's Bake Shop, by the way, in West Des Moines, Iowa. A man who was well-dressed came in the morning sometimes and would get a coffee and a roll or something like that, and different things. And one time he tried to strike up a conversation with my brother, who had come out of the back room. My brother, Frank, wrote down on a thing, "I'm deaf, can't hear, so just write it out." So they started an exchange like that. And this went on for a few months. Finally, this man wrote down once, said, "How do you like being a baker?" And my brother said, "I hate it." So he said, "Well, what would you like to do?" And my brother said, "Well, I'm good at machines. I know how to run machines and things like that. That's mechanic stuff. I think I'm good at that. Well, this man said, well, that's my business. I own a business, and we make jet engine nozzles. It was called Delavan Manufacturing Company. Started in World War II. And so he asked my brother if he'd like to come work for him, and my brother said, sure. So my brother went to work for him. And the owner, Mr. Delavan, told his foreman, just basically, see what Harkin can do, give him a job, give him something. Some weeks went by, and Mr. Delavan came back out on the shop floor. There were about 250 people worked there. Came back on the shop floor, asked his foreman, how's Harkin? And the guy said, oh my God, this guy is fantastic. I put him on a drill press where they have to drill these very finely engineered holes in jet engine nozzles. Gosh, he never makes a mistake. He gets more parts per hour than anyone else, never makes a mistake. He's just incredible. Well, Mr. Delvin said, well, you wanted to find out why. So they were observing him. And this was a noisy place. A lot of bells clanging and drills going and a lot of noise. Didn't bother my brother a bit.
He was able to focus in a way that others couldn't.
He kept focused on his job. So Mr. Delavan years later told me, after I'd been elected to Congress and I met him finally, he told me, he said, I hired your brother out of the goodness of my heart. But after we found out what a good worker he was, I went out and hired more deaf people because they turned out to be my best workers.
Less disability and more an ability that was not recognized up until then.
That's right. Like I said, if you were deaf, you just couldn't do things. And that was true of almost all people with disabilities.
So as you can tell from that clip, it's a great lesson in how, we can work to really realize the potential that is out there, particularly with this large pool of workers that is, largely untapped. And so I want to next turn it over and send it back to Sage. And she's going to talk about some more specific policy options that you can actually pursue in her conversation with Senator Massey. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sage.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I would highly recommend checking out that podcast. Really, really interesting conversation there between Senator Harkin and our podcast. I am pleased now to be joined by Tennessee State Senator Becky Massey. Becky Massey has been in the legislature since 2011, and she has been a lifelong advocate of people with disabilities. And she was also a national task force member, so has a very intimate understanding of that entire process. So thank you so much for joining us, Senator Massey.
Thank you for having me. I always look forward to being with you, with the folks at NCSL.
Well, we enjoy having you. So let's get started. So before assuming office in 2011, you served as the executive director of the Sertoma Center. And this is an organization that serves adults with developmental disabilities. Can you talk a little bit more about your background and how you became an advocate for people with disabilities?
Well, I actually ended up at Sertoma accidentally almost. I was looking for work. I had no background working with people with disabilities, and I had been a stay-at-home mom, community worker, and fell into the job there, started out doing public relations and fundraising, and then a few years later became the executive director, and fell in love with the folks, fell in love with the population, and became an advocate for people that didn't have a voice, that often is the most marginalized segment of our society. And I started going to our state capital, to Nashville, to advocate for folks with disabilities. And over the years, it just kind of grew on me. And ultimately, that really, even though I grew up in a political family, that was actually what really drove me to running for office, was through being at Sertoma Center and advocating for adults with disabilities.
Wow. And obviously, as a state senator, you've continued your work on disability issues, sponsoring legislation relating to transportation, education, procurement, state employment, all policy areas within the Work Matters report that we just went over. Can you kind of bring the pages to life for us and talk a little bit more about your work on disability issues as a legislator?
Absolutely. You know, of course, when you arrive in the legislature, people know what your background is, and so they gravitate towards you with that type of legislation. And you know, in at one point I told him, I said, I don't want to carry all the disability legislation, because you, as a member, you learn more about the subject matter when you are carrying legislation. We've all been there and done that. But it has definitely been a passion of mine. So, you know, as you said, you know, the different ones that I've worked on, I guess, you know, one of the first ones was actually looking at a divorce case of a parent that had a disability, and that in deciding custody, you couldn't use their disability as either for or against. It was basically neutral, and there were several other things in the early stages. I do have my Work Matters book here,
Very nice.
which I refer to often, and I actually had been at an NCSL meeting, and everybody introduced what their day job was, and they said, "Oh, your day job is working with people with disabilities. Could you come to 2 meetings?" And that was the beginning of the working with Work Matters and all the activities. And of course, you know, for me, it's more personal. When you talk about a specific policy, I visualize the people. I know their names. I worked with them. I was there 24 years totally. And, but, you know, I was able to work with, you know, we were one of the first states to pass the ABLE Act to let folks get their savings. Of course, Senator Harkin was very involved in that, but Senator Alexander was also. And I actually was able to go to Washington before their committee and testify on policies that keep people with disabilities in poverty. So, but a couple of the other things that I've done is, you know, you mentioned the state as a model employer. I'm actually working on that this year. That we had it all set up last year. We had a new governor, and I wanted to wait till he kind of got it, you know, in so they could have buy-in to it. And then it got waylaid by COVID. So I actually presented it this week in committee and passed unanimously. And it is funded, the position to oversee it in the Department of Human Resources is funded. And ours isn't as prescriptive as far as setting hiring goals as it is setting a framework to training the other departments, having each of the departments kind of set up their own training program in order to recruit, hire, advance folks with disabilities. And that's all kinds of disabilities, whether it's ambulatory, visual, intellectual, the wide diversity of it. I did do added the disability-owned businesses to our diversity business enterprise. And, you know, that was something, but it's still, people are not educated as much on that as they need to. My local city was doing a diversity employment fair basically, and they listed all the others, but didn't list diversity. And I said, you need to make sure you add that. You're forgetting something.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
You've got to be constantly on your toes. You know, it's important, you know, for people to be able to communicate. So I had made 2 deaf-related bills. One, that American Sign Language is a foreign language credit now in Tennessee high schools. And then also set up a pilot program for a deaf mentor program for new parents with a child with that is deaf, because if they don't have that by the time they reach elementary school, they're so far behind. And then the big one that I did last year was the accessible transportation. And it was the first dedicated office of accessible transportation in our Department of Transportation in the country. And basically, they're going to be doing a baseline. And of course, my department said, well, we don't need it. We already do this. And I'm going, not really. We're not, we may do it at a state level, but we don't help the communities, the counties, cities connect with each other. And we'd have people that would take the accessible transportation to the doctor, but their doctor was a mile across the county line and the transportation couldn't take them over there. So right now they're in a process of coming up with their very first kind of baseline report of where we are. And then we'll be working with them to work for improvements on that, because transportation really is the number one barrier for people with disabilities to achieve meaningful employment.
Absolutely. Wow, so much going on in your state. Thank you so much for sharing. Why are disability issues, I mean, this kind of sounds obvious, but why are disability issues important? Especially right now, you mentioned the pandemic. We're about a year into the pandemic. So why should lawmakers and staff be thinking about disability inclusion in their legislative work?
Well, personally, I think they need to think about it all the time, not just as a result of the pandemic, but our states are grappling with our economy and rebooting our economy. And people with disabilities are a key factor in the state's ability to build a strong, inclusive workforce, which translates to economic success and quality of life. It does affect a large number of the citizens in the individual states, and it's the right thing to do. But, hiring people with disabilities leads to innovation, creativity, and it's a loyal and reliable workforce. So there's all kinds of reasons to move in that direction, but it's the right thing to do, and it helps in our economic recovery, which we're all hungry for right now.
Absolutely. So yeah, as somebody who has, again, just done so much on this issue, what advice do you have for new legislators and staff, the folks that are tuning in right now, for folks that are working on these issues related to people with disabilities? What advice do you have?
Well, there's several. First, get a copy of Work Matters. It's a valuable tool set, and it really is. I still refer to it after all these years, just, because I always come up with something that, well, I didn't do that. I could maybe do that now or something, but get to know your disability champions, not only in your communities, but in your state, and learn from them. Visit your providers in your area. So you've got that personal face with it. You've got that contact that, as legislators, we cannot know everything about everything. So we've got to find the resources of the folks that can help us go deeper and dig deeper. Participate like folks are doing today in these wonderful webinars. And then also in the sessions, a lot of times some of the groups have a pre-session that are more deep dives in issues and oftentimes in disabilities. And of course, NCSL is always a resource if you're wanting to find out whether it's stats on it, whether it's sample legislation that you're not sure if it exists. Reach out to NCSL. They can help with sending experts to your state to testify for your committees. And the biggest way is, and of course, also another resource is the ODEP, the Office of Employment Disability and Disabilities as department in the Department of Labor. But the main way is carry a piece of legislation regarding disability, because that's really when you dig the deepest and you learn the most, is by carrying it and learning and the ins and outs and why it's important. Because really, the folks, our society is judged by what we do for the least of these, and folks with disabilities just don't have the voice like the road builders, the home builders, the insurance companies, and all these other high-powered lobbyists and associations and things. They're kind of the forgotten, majority out there. And so you need to be their voice and reach out to them, and you will grow and learn and benefit more than you will give in return.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Senator Becky Massey. Folks, if you have any questions for her, again, I would highly recommend dropping those in the chat. She is going to stick around and answer questions. Thank you again so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
And without further ado, I'm going to turn it back over to Josh.
Great, thanks, Sage, and thank you again, Senator Massey. Really great fit in CSL into this issue. You've heard a lot about policy options that are available to you from Sage and from Senator Massey. And we really hope that you look at some of the links in the chat as resources. I wanted to talk a little bit about some additional resources that we have in CSL. The Work Matters report, of course, has been referenced multiple times, as well as an update to that we published last year. I also wanted to mention a report series that we're currently working on. We have two of the 4 reports done in this series that really is looking at COVID-19 and its impact on employment for people with disabilities. So we're covering issues like some of the economic figures that Sage referenced and what economic impact and disparities might exist for people with disabilities, particularly as the economy took such a large hit. Also looking at the promise of telework and the opportunities that presents people with disabilities, as well as some challenges that might be presented as well. We're looking at workplace safety, which is a very big issue now, of course. And how do we safely return workers to work, and while also making sure that we're accommodating those who have particular health needs that might make them higher risk of getting severely ill from COVID-19, and some of those complex factors that business owners and policymakers have to be looking at and evaluating right now. And then the final report is going to look at kind of looking more long-term, as Senator Massey referenced, states are really turning towards an economic recovery mode. And what can states do to make sure that as we're working on economic recovery, as we're looking at how to get people back into work and really lower those unemployment rates, are the programs and workforce development programs being utilized? Are they inclusive and accessible to people with disabilities? Really making sure that people with disabilities are a part of that recovery and not being left behind. And so I believe we have some resources in the chat and another link that will link you to kind of our central disability employment hub on our website that contains a lot of important resources and reports and other materials that we've created on this topic. And I encourage you to look at those. A number of the resources that we have produced are part of a partnership and a collaborative that we participate in called the State Exchange on Employment and Disability, or SEED. SEED is, again, an initiative that is funded through the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. And it's really a partnership between a number of kind of membership organizations like NCSL. So we partner with NCSL as part of this, and we partner with the National Governors Association, Council of State Governors, or State Governments, sorry, the Western Governors Association, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. There's a long list. I think there's about 8 or so partners now, partner organizations, and we all kind of work collaboratively together on this issue of disability employment, on the issue of enhancing employment opportunities for people with disabilities and removing employment barriers. Again, thinking very broadly, really trying to connect local, state, and federal challenges and issues and policies, and really help educate and inform legislators and other policymakers as they work on these issues. NCSL can provide a number of services to you as our members. Senator Massey did reference some of those, such as doing customized research for you if you want some information about what other states are doing, examples from other states. You want to know kind of what research is showing about certain policy issues. We are more than happy to help you with those. Also, we can come testify in your states if you're having committee hearings and would like kind of a neutral, nonpartisan voice on an issue. Again, providing examples from other states and really digging deep into an issue for you and for your committees. We are more than happy to provide that service to you. And we also organize a number of convenings kind of formal convenings to really help connect you with your legislative peers in other states. This would perhaps be one of them, but we also host a lot of more interactive opportunities, the largest of which is typically, COVID has kind of disrupted this a little bit, but our legislative summit meeting that we hold typically every summer is kind of our main gathering where we really bring legislators together and help them share ideas and experiences with one another. And that's a really great learning experience. So I encourage you to look into those things as well. Again, look into the resources we have provided. And I think at this point, if we have questions, we will take any questions that you guys have, and Senator Massey is also here to help answer any questions that might be out there. All right, well, if we don't have any questions, and that's okay, I'll give it maybe just a little bit longer, but I think we're going to post the contact information for Sage and I. So our email addresses should be available to you in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us anytime. We are here to help you in any way, connect you, either provide you information ourselves or help connect you to the right people nationally to help get you the answers you're looking for. I do believe there is a link at the bottom of your chat box to do an evaluation survey. It's just one question that we ask you to answer about this webinar. So I encourage you, please, if you can respond to that, that'd be very helpful to us to help make sure that we continually increase or improve the quality of these convenings. And with that, I just want to say thank you for joining us. And on behalf of my colleague Sage as well, I'm sure, and Senator Massey, please have a great day, have a great weekend. And thank you for joining NCSL's State Policy 101 series.